Hello, everybody. Welcome to World Edition. My name is Nick Palavito. I will not be your host today. That's going to be up to Mark Lee, who's in the background. He'll be here very shortly. But it looks like today we also do have a special guest, Dan Luzader, and we'll bring him in and ask him a little bit about himself. Dan, this is Nick. Where are you
Good
from?
morning.
Yeah, good
I'm
morning.
in Cannon Beach, Oregon.
Oh, you're in Oregon. Okay, so it's early there. It's like 7 o'clock in the morning, something like
It
that.
is.
So yeah, we do all over the place. Well, tell the audience a little about who you are and what you do.
Well, I've been a journalist for some 40 years, over 40 years actually. Uh, I recently written a book, The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, the CIA, and the Corruption of American Journalism. So I'm a longtime journalist. I've been at it since I was 17 years old, and still at it.
Okay, yeah, and I did notice Pulitzer awarded. Tell us a little about the Pulitzer. What's that all about?
So in 1982, I was working at the Fort Wayne News Sentinel in Indiana, and there was it's a city of three rivers. Was a big flood that year. Drew national attention. Ronald Reagan came and threw a few sandbags on the sandbag lines in Fort Wayne, but a lot of people were displaced, including me and most of the staff of the Fort Wayne News Sentinel. And we put together coverage that won the Pulitzer that year for general local reporting. And some of my work was collected in college textbooks on how to write feature stories under the press of deadline when you're evacuated from your home, I guess.
Okay. Well, tell us about a little bit also about Oregon. I used to live in a place called Bellingham, Washington.
uh,
So I lived there for about 10 years, which you might know about.
I
What
do.
what prompted you to Oregon anyway?
Well, actually, we were in Colorado for most of the past 35 years. I had worked at the Rocky Mountain News there, but both my kids decided to both my younger kids decided to go to Lewis and Clark College out here in Oregon. They both graduated. My daughter went on to finish law school there and has started practicing law. And my son graduated and went to work for the OHSU hospital there doing cancer research. And so we decided we'd follow them out here to Oregon. We wound up on the coast. It's a beautiful place to be.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds fair enough. Now I guess we get to the tough part, the book. Tell us a little bit about the book.
So the Manchurian Journalist evolved out of a experience I had with the Church of Scientology. The I was freelance writing, working for various outlets as a freelancer, and I got a call from the Church of Scientology. They were reviving a magazine they'd published for many years, and they had been out of print. They were looking for journalists to come help them, and they asked me if I would take a look at the media coverage about the Church of Scientology and give them some evaluation about its fairness, its balance, etc. So I agreed to do that. And in the process, took a look at a book that was written by Lawrence Wright, who's a New Yorker, writer for the New Yorker. He's published many books. He's a high-profile journalist who won a Pulitzer in 2008 for his work on Al Qaeda, a book he wrote about Al Qaeda, Looming Tower. But as I was looking into his coverage of the church, of the book he wrote, and a subsequent film that was done by the documentarian Alex Gibney, I discovered something more interesting than his work with the Church of Scientology, and that he had been involved with a program that was used to recruit journalists and people into publishing, into the media in general. That was a program started by the CIA and various friends within the intelligence community. And as I looked more closely at all that, I discovered this network that had really been unreported about, that began really after World War II, immediately with the formation of the CIA from the OSS. And the deeper I got into that story, the more interesting things I found, including a trail that showed how these recruiting networks worked and how Lawrence Wright participated in them.
Okay, so the thing is this a book about that? In other words, how people get recruited into Scientology?
It was more about Lawrence Wright's history as a reporter and undisclosed facts about his family history. He had written a memoir when he was a young man, actually 39. And he had talked about this path that he had used to become a conscientious objector. He came from a military oriented family. His father was a military man. During the Vietnam War, he became a conscientious objector. And so his story was about that. But he left out a few interesting details,
Mhm.
including the fact that his father worked for the former executive trial prosecutor at the Nuremberg war trials. His father was president of a small storefront bank, and the bank was owned by a man named Robert Story from Dallas. And Story was an important figure in the creation of the CIA. He was also the individual who kept the state of Texas from investigating the Kennedy assassination separately as a murder. He was influential in formation of the Warren Commission, and he helped build programs that recruited people for intelligence purposes for the United States through the Board of Foreign Scholarships, the Fulbright program through the State Department. But yet Lawrence Wright never mentioned this individual in any of his writings, even though his father was very closely associated with foundations that were used by the CIA to fund clandestine programs, including domestic propaganda in the United States.
Hey, Dan, one of the things that I know you talk about in the book, The Manchurian Journalist, and everything along these lines is how there is less respect, and we've been talking about it on this network. That's part of the reason that Nick and Kim founded it, for the institution of the Fourth Estate and journalism in general. I know a lot of people have been thinking about that with the presidential race. I know that certain candidates like Donald Trump have talked about being targeted and everything. And then, of course, there's been times when folks on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, have been targeted, sometimes by social media and all along those lines. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I know the book Street Talk does talk about how you sometimes feel that maybe journalists are being manipulated, if I can use that kind of term and everything. So I just wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit on that as well, because I did get a chance to hear a little bit of what this particular book is about.
Well, I think there has been a lot of efforts to manipulate journalists over the years. I've witnessed a few of them myself. But in essence, this program that was created, or these programs that were participated in by individuals within the publishing industry, within the media, were basically designed to help promote the ideas of Western cultural values, as opposed to communism, socialism, and other forms of political organization. But the issues that go to our current state of journalism and how things are covered are much deeper than what's going on here. We've seen the deterioration of reporting, actually, because the foundations, I believe, of reporting have been affected by the demise in the print media, the loss of the infrastructure that produced journalists in this country who were more independent. But we are in an era now, I think, where most of us turn to our news for our news to the national media. We're at a place where we're watching most of the news developments on national TV, and the infrastructure of local media, which really fed our national media and helped put together sound journalism, at least accurate, well-reported journalism. That infrastructure has been in serious decline for the last 20 years.
So
Dan,
what
hold
can
on a second.
we as news consumers do?
What can we as news consumers do?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, I think we're sort of at the mercy of this system that has fallen apart. There's been a hole in the boat for a long time, and journalism has been sinking as a result of that. We have stopped supporting local newspapers because of the many factors. The internet has had a huge impact on the way we develop information. I think as local consumers of news, we're at a point where we have to work hard as individuals to try to determine what is accurate and what is not. Those things are not easy. If you're watching the various political commentators on television, you've got a choice of the left side, the right side, and some things in the middle, but the things in the middle are not as prevalent as the things on the right and the left. So commentary mixed in with reporting is not serving us very well, I think.
I send it to you.
I sent it to me. Let me see if I can find it up.
In the process of trying to
Lisa,
determine
the
what
working
fact-
of the program, this is Mark.
especially on the national political scene.
Yeah, you know, Rick, one of the solutions to this garbage, which is the media, is to have a metric rating system like they do in chess, they do in hotels, they do in restaurants. In other words, like when I go to a restaurant, I look at reviews, I look at their rankings. In other words, are they 4, 4.5, 4? Are they 3 or they're 1.9? When I go to hotels, it's the same thing. I look at their star rankings, their guest rankings, and also reviews. Now let's go to the media. There are no reviews. There are no, and even in chess, which I play, you know, being a chess master, everybody knows the ranking system makes a difference. The minute I talk to a chess player, they want to know what my ELO is. That's the international version of USCF rating. And I tell them it's 2257 and they shut up. In other words, they go, because they're not even close to that. But now when you go to journalism, there is no ranking system.
There is somewhat rankings. It's called the Arbitron and Nielsen's and a bunch of other things. I don't know what Dan thinks about those and everything, but I was curious his thoughts around. Hold on a second, because I was curious his thoughts around local media, because local media has been dying for a while, and even here in Durham, as Jacoby knows, we had the Independent, and a number of these have been gobbled up by bigger companies like Knight Ridder and even some of the bigger establishments. We've seen that in radio as well. So I just wanted your thoughts around how we can escape some of the media monopolies, because there are definitely media monopolies, Dan, and your thoughts around that, because whether you look at radio, whether you look at newspapers, because a lot of our small newspapers, like here in Durham, North Carolina, we had the Independent, and a lot of them have been bought up and have been co-opted and everything. So just wanted your take on that.
Co-opted is a good description. When I started in journalism as a police reporter when I was still a teenager, the newspapers primarily were either locally owned or they were part of small chains that were still family owned. Over the years, I watched as corporate media moved in and took over most of the newspapers that from local owners, and I think that was the beginning of change for communities and the reporting on local communities. I was working for the Fort Wayne News Sentinel when Knight Ridder
Hold on one second.
purchased the newspaper. And the changes were fairly dramatic. They brought in some ideas that were corporate. They made some changes in how news was delivered. They were still trying to work, I think, on the basic premises of good, accurate reporting at the time. But as those corporate entities started taking over more and more newspapers, they lost their connection to the local community. They were bringing in ideas from outside. They were homogenizing what was done in journalism, much the way McDonald's homogenized our.
In LA, what's happened to the LA Times is saddening and annoying. It gets skinnier and skinnier, and they're so strapped for cash now they can't even put in sports scores because they opted for a cheap printing system that needs to print so early in the day that they can't even include, sports.
Hey,
Right.
Dan, just really quickly along those same lines of what Rick just asked you and everything, I know that when I was coming up and I went to Marquette and everything, matter of fact, I saw Jacoby recently because I had some of my Marquette alumni at the game on Saturday and everything, but definitely that had a rich journalism program, and I went into journalism partially because of Watergate, and I was a big fan of the investigations of Woodward and Bernstein and people like that, and thought I was going to be the next big investigative reporter. As I've grown further into journalism, I've developed more of a Charles Kuralt style and everything that I prefer and everything. But I was just wondering, what got you into journalism? I know that you have been a police reporter, you've been a columnist, and by the way, I've done column work as well, and you've been an investigative reporter. But what drew you into journalism? What was it about journalism that was a calling for you, for lack of a better term?
The Vietnam War was going on when I was graduating from high school, and I had a teacher in my high school class who, recognizing I didn't know what direction I was going, suggested I try a little sports reporting for the high school newspaper, which I did. And then I went straight into college to get that college deferment to stay out of Vietnam, really. In the beginning, and was offered a place on the college newspaper doing a little sports reporting. But then a job came open on the local gritty daily paper in the industrial town where I'd grown up, and I was introduced to a whole new idea about life and living and people on the street, and I was fascinated by that. And I turned into a pretty aggressive police reporter, chasing almost everything that happened, running down stories. And that energy stayed with me. And after I graduated from college, I took a job in Fort Wayne on the copy desk, because those were the only jobs open at the moment. And after a year on the copy desk, the editor called me into his office and he said, "Close the door. You're the worst copy editor I ever hired." I said, "Well, I know I'm not a great speller, but I keep my dictionary around. I don't know what I'm doing wrong." He said, "Well, you're rewriting everybody's copy in the newsroom so it sounds like you. I've got 35 reporters out there. I want them to sound like themselves." I said, "Oh, am I fired?" He said, "No, you're our new columnist." And so I started writing a column. I didn't have any sources on the street. I didn't know anybody, but I got out there and I worked the streets every day. I found interesting stories and I wrote them 3 times a week, in all some 900 columns over a period of 7 years. But in the course of that, I started running into stories that weren't being reported, investigative type stories. And so I was picked up by the Indianapolis Star for their 4-member investigative team, and I started doing hardcore investigative reporting. I got into my blood, and I stayed with it for the next 40 years.
Well, you've been doing quite a bit and everything. Just really quickly, I know you received a Pulitzer Prize as well, so I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that, because it was a shared Pulitzer Prize, and I know our listeners would be interested in that, because apparently it dealt with something that we sometimes face now, even here in the Southeast, which is dramatic flooding, and I know that sometimes can impact folks and everything. So can you share a little bit about that shared Pulitzer Prize?
Sure. As the floods developed in 1982 in Fort Wayne at the confluence of 3 rivers, and people were being evacuated, most of the staff on the Fort Wayne News Sentinel, and also on the other daily newspaper — there were actually 2 vigorous newspapers in Fort Wayne at the time. The Journal Gazette was the other. And there was a lot of competition among the reporters to get out there and find stories during the flood. And so my history had been, writing about common people and common situations. And I went down to the scene of the sandbag lines late at night. There were desperate efforts to save a historic neighborhood. Teenagers were brought in from the high schools around and very courageously were standing atop shaky sandbag lines as big pumps were being used to throw water back into the rivers in the backed up areas. And it was pretty dramatic. And so with that kind of material behind me, I was able to craft some stories that were pretty dramatic and pretty colorful. And those were my contributions to the Pulitzer. A number of other reporters were out there on the street as well, and we covered the flood from how to put sand in a sandbag to what it was like to see your house float down the middle of the street.
What happened to your research into Scientology?
My research into Scientology, that was a true education, because when the church asked me if I would take over their media coverage, I said, "Well, I'm happy to do that, but you're going to have to open up everything to me that relates to the criticism against the church. I need to see documents. I need to be satisfied that what you're telling me is true. And they cooperated with that. In fact, I traveled around the world. I visited Scientologists in Hungary, in Australia, in Ireland, and England, a number of other places. I tested the stories that the media had produced about Scientology and some of the arguments that were made about them. And I found that there were major holes in that media coverage. A lot of it stemmed from the tabloid coverage that had come out of Hollywood about the church and its history. But it was picked up and exploited, I think, in many circumstances by the media for good sensational stories. But no one was getting on the inside of the church. No one was sitting down with the principal people who were operating on a day-to-day basis. I did that. I sat down with a church leader, David Miscavige. I sat down with top executives of the organization. I asked them frank questions, and when they answered them, I asked for the documents that backed them up.
Hey, just really quickly, Dan, I think we got our other host, Steve, here as well and everything. But I know Nick, sometimes when he's here, he complains about the nature of college and the nature of what is being taught in college, and sometimes feeling that things are being taught that are less important, and so maybe some of the liberal arts. I'm actually a fan of the liberal arts and everything, but I just wanted your take, because I know that even some of your own work is used in college textbooks for journalism. So I just wanted your take on how journalism is being taught and how colleges are being taught in this particular day and time.
You know, I think I offended my college alumni journalism colleagues when I said at one point after the floods, as a matter of fact, when I was interviewed by people, that most of what journalists learn, they learn on the street, and that's the best place to learn about journalism. But I think colleges have really had an impact on journalism as a changeover was occurring about the time that I started. In the old days, reporters were hired not because of a journalism degree, but because of their ability to get people to talk to them and to get them to build sources and for the writing that they were innately able to do. But the journalism schools did add a lot about ethics and about sound operations of journalism, trying to make it more into a profession than a craft, I think. And so they served a purpose. But in the course of the first few years when I was still working, and newspapers were still being produced on the linotypes at that time, if you can believe it or not, there was a difference in attitude. If you didn't have a college degree in journalism, it was much more difficult to get on the inside. And unfortunately, there were a lot of good, colorful reporters probably that were not participating in journalism as a result of not having gone to journalism school. Journalism schools today now face a really tough way to go because there aren't that many jobs out there. And so many journalism schools are pointing people in the direction of public relations, other types of media, social media for journalism practices. But we have, as I've said before, lost that institutional knowledge, those old reporters that have been around forever that told you where to find the back door to get down to the jail holding cell so you could do an interview with the recently arrested suspects. That kind of knowledge has evaporated. Also, the relationship between places that produce news and reporters have changed because the access, without the attention of local media constantly coming and knocking on the door of your local police department, demanding records and access to reports, that kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. If I go down to my local police department in Cannon Beach and I ask for a police report, they're going to ask me why. And they're going to argue with me. Those institutional things served us pretty well because we got access to news. And now getting access is harder. It's controlled by public affairs officers. It's controlled by those who want to restrict access. And that's an unfortunate situation.
Hey, you've had the pleasure of talking to some amazing people. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about that, because when I was reading, I saw that you had the pleasure of talking to Vernon Jordan, right around the time of his death, I believe, and everything along those lines. And of course, also Mother Teresa and a number of other well-known folks, including some folks that weren't as well-known, like this gentleman that apparently spent time adrift in the Bermuda Triangle and everything like that. So just wondering if you could share a little bit about some of those journalistic experiences that you had.
You know, one of the things I did approach journalism in a little different way than a lot of people. And as a columnist, I had a different sort of access, and I could also write in a little more colorful way. But when Vernon Jordan was in Fort Wayne and was shot in an attempted assassination, he was with a woman who had worked with the local NAACP. Her name was Martha Coleman, and I happened to know her pretty well. We had a social relationship, had gone out to dinner a couple of times. And so when the shooting happened, she went into hiding immediately. Nobody knew who was responsible for that. Vernon Jordan survived that attempt. He was in the hospital for several days in Fort Wayne. And the national media was all over the story. People from all over the country were there trying to report on the situation. But being a local reporter with the local sources, I managed to find Martha Coleman, and I got the interview with her about her experience that night, and that was the first reporting on it. The national media packed up and moved out of town. The number of stories that I approached there as a columnist gave me an opportunity to write in a little more colorful way and dramatic way. My goal always was to get on the inside of things. But I did an interview with Lyle Van Amen, the man whose small plane went down in the Bermuda Triangle, and he drifted for several days alone after other members on the plane perished, and then was rescued by chance by a U.S. Coast Guard helicopter floating off the coast of Cuba, some 90 miles or more from where he had gone into the water. And I did a lengthy interviews with him, and that story was in every major newspaper supplement on a Sunday, and it bannered the Chicago Tribune on a Sunday morning because of the color and the drama that was in the story, I think.
What about Mother Teresa? Because I know you had the pleasure of talking to Mother Teresa as well.
I did, and that was a fairly a really interesting conversation. I still remember how delicate her handshake was when she put her hand in mine. The funny thing about that story is I look back these days after writing about her visit to Fort Wayne and meeting with hundreds of local people there for a speech, was that there was some feedback on the coverage of Mother Teresa in the Fort Wayne paper by local people, and letters to the editor. And one of the letters to the editor complimented the reporters on what a great job they had done of covering Mother Teresa. And then the letter said, even Dan Luzader managed to do a good job.
Good job on that and everything. What is your take, just really quickly, on opening it up to other people and everything, but what is your take on the Democratic convention? Because we know that that's coming up, and we've seen a lot of people paying attention to the political back and forth between the various candidates and everything. But what is your take now that we've had the RNC and the DNC is about to be in Chicago? We know way back in '69, there was a lot of upheaval with different protests, and there are some people that are saying we might get something similar this time around. But what is your take on the Democratic process as it stands right now?
I have not covered political events for a good number of years, but I'm very familiar with them from doing that for a long period of time. I just had a conversation recently about the DNC and what is about to happen there, and the kinds of reporting that are going to go on, and what should be happening. It's a very rich experience for a journalist to be in Chicago right now, I think, with the protests that are coming over the situation in Gaza and the ceasefire. There are opportunities, I think, for reporters, vast opportunities to tell some very important stories right now, especially as the Democrat National Convention is unfolding. The the concerns that I have is how vigorous that reporting is and how thorough it is. There are so many conflicting political views. There's so much misinformation and disinformation that's going on. It's so hard for us as laymen to sort through it all and know exactly what we can depend on and what's credible.
So you reported on Columbine, the shooting. Any thoughts on that on its 25th anniversary?
Well, that was the last story I did for daily newspapers as a reporter working for daily newspapers. I started freelancing almost immediately after that. But there's an interesting story that goes along with my coverage of the Columbine case. I was I had a penchant for getting into conflict with editors over issues about what should or should not be reported and ethical questions. And I'd gotten crossways with editors at the Rocky Mountain News in Denver. And so they had sent me down to cover the state legislature, which would be a plum assignment for a lot of reporters, but I liked investigative reporting much more. But while I was down there, Columbine happened, and I was writing a bit about the reaction of state lawmakers. But I'd been doing investigative reporting for them for a long time, and I hadn't gotten a call to come back to the newsroom to assist with the Columbine coverage. But after 3 days, I got a call from the city editor, and he said, "We have a problem." I said, "What's that?" He said, "We let Police Beat slide, and we don't have a police reporter who has sources in the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. We can't even figure out who's running the investigation, while the Denver Post is beating us every day because they kept their police beat alive." And I said, "Well, what is it you want me to do?" They said, "Can you find out who's running the investigation?" Well, a couple of years before, I'd done an investigation into organized crime trying to take over the Denver taxi industry. And in the course of that, I discovered that there was a lot of drug running and gun running going on using the taxis. And so I had developed sources in the underground gun community, and I knew that the police were trying to figure out where the guns came from in Columbine, and they'd been very closed-mouthed. They weren't answering the telephones at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. You couldn't get through to them. At least the Rocky couldn't get through to them. So I started calling sources that I had used in the taxi investigation, and I finally found an informant for police who knew that the guns had come from the same place as a weapon that was used to kill a Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy several years before. So I called the phone of the detective that had investigated that case, and I left a message. I said who I was, and I said, "I want to know where the gun came from that was used to kill Officer Timothy Mossbrucker." About 15 minutes later, I got a call from Lieutenant John Kickbush, and he said, "You called one of my detectives and you asked this question, and I want to know why." I said, "Meet me for coffee and I'll tell you." So he did. And after that, our conversation resulted in me going inside the investigation in Columbine, where I was given access to see what the police had seen, to see the videos and other things, and was able to cover it from inside.
And you were covering it for the Rocky Mountain News. The News is gone now. It's been gone. It went out of business 15 years ago. Now there's only the Denver Post.
That's right. Unfortunately, that 150-year-old newspaper, which was a vigorous source of reporting for that local community, and which did some marvelous stories over the years that I was there, a big newspaper with a strong staff that was really able to produce some high-quality journalism, just disappeared from the landscape. I had left the paper by then and gone to work for a magazine in New York, of all things, writing about the internet. But the newspaper's demise, as with so many of our great newspapers in this country, was an example of where profits were given a higher priority than the community where these organizations, where this newspaper and newspapers like this all over the country were contributing to the fabric of community. And it's a sad thing to see these papers disappear.
Yeah. Jacoby mentioned something really quickly earlier, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about it, because apparently we lost a pioneer in television journalism, that being Phil Donahue. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about Phil Donahue as a person.
Well, I never had the pleasure of meeting him or talking with him, but certainly he was a light offering new information into the television community at the time. I think he was probably, well, I don't know a lot about his career. I think that he was probably instrumental in helping bring some of the commentary and different ideas and unreported things to the American public in ways that people are still trying to accomplish, but not accomplishing them very well.
Yeah. Steve, you got any questions? I know that you're here, and I know you've definitely have been following the political landscape, particularly with the Democratic convention starting up, and of course we've got Kamala and Tim Walz doing their bus tour and everything. But you got any questions for Dan Lassiter?
No, I just want to thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to meet you. I look forward to get to know you better. I do some media work. Obviously, I'm a city council member and looking to run for another office next year. But it's just great. I followed you. I think it's great that you're here. And I think my daughter's a journalist, and she's actually moving to Nairobi next week for 4 months with a fellowship with the Associated Press. And so it's been interesting to kind of follow her career and looking at how journalism is changing. I always wanted to be a journalist growing up, and my parents were from India, so it wasn't really accepted that you would go into something outside of medicine or engineering. And I ended up pursuing law. But now that the granddaughter's a journalist, it's been really wonderful watching kind of like the opportunities. And, I think that it's become more of, theater on the television, broadcast journalism. But still the written journalism, I think, is important, the digital. My daughter's a writer. So hopefully we'll see some good pieces written about, the convention. I think a big night tonight with President Biden. I think it's going to be an emotional night. I think it really hasn't hit a lot of us that he will be leaving to go off and to enjoy the final sunset of his life. But it's a lot of knowledge and history of government service over 60 years that is going to be remembered this evening, and that he's leaving, and then he'll no longer be the president, which is, I think it really hasn't hit a lot of people yet, but I think it'll hit the Democrats tonight, and then got to move it on. But yeah. So I just wanted to I don't really have any questions, but it's great to have you here. I don't know if you have any insights about the convention, where you think we are politically today in America. With any insight you would have would be great.
Well, I'm really glad to hear about your daughter's internship with Associated Press, and that's a fantastic opportunity. And I'm glad to know that there is still some work going on out there where people can train and learn. Associated Press has been one of the organizations, as UPI was alongside it, that helped distribute community news around the country and around the world. Really, when journalists were actively working on local reporting, I think it's so extremely important. The Fourth Estate plays a huge role in American democracy and the unfolding of democracy in the way that it should unfold, and with the deterioration of journalists and the loss of opportunities for journalists to report in credible arenas, it's having an impact. It continues to have an impact, I think, on democracy and the vigorousness and viability of it. It's a challenging time right now. I would like to see journalism explored in a way that recognizes its vital role as the Fourth Estate to produce the kinds of investigative reporting and the kinds of just good, solid reporting that used to be the standard fare within print media. I think we need to find a way to create new opportunities for journalists to write about what's going on, to be able to experience, to put their thoughts and their experiences into words that continue to create the living history that newspapers used to create every day in communities all across the country. One of the things I think that we've lost that's important is that newspapers used to tell you things that are not reported anymore. Even small things like publishing in an agate type the lawsuits that were filed in a local community in a day, the marriages and divorces, the accident records. those things are being lost to history because they're not being reported and can't be accessed anymore. And people like me still doing investigative reporting independently on their own rely too much on those historical records that were recorded by newspapers. Well, I can go back 50 years, look at newspapers and the reporting that was going on then, and be able to extract information that's relevant to changes over the periods of time since then. So
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
some of my
Or to go back. One nice thing I've observed is to go back in history and observe other patterns and see whether there's anything we can learn, right? And just this morning I was running to John F. Kennedy's Democratic acceptance speech at the convention in 1960, and was amazing to hear, kind of like, maybe this administration can learn a little bit about what Kennedy was saying, that, he said the New Deal and the Fair Deal were promises made by American presidents, but I propose to you not a set of promises, but a set of challenges to the American people. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, I'm going to give it to you, the American people, to tell me what we should be doing in the new frontier. And I thought that was quite amazing to hear that. And I think that this is something I think the Democrats now today need to learn from, is kind of like, what can they do to challenge the people of this country, like to demand more of their president and demand more of their governments in terms of not only services, but the way we conduct ourselves, the way we carry ourselves. I think the negative attack back to Trump and back, I think it's a good short-term victory, but I think at the end of the day, when the poll number bumps are gone, that's not going to be enough. So that's just my opinion, but I had to go back and listen to a president who's no longer alive, obviously was assassinated, and wouldn't be alive today, probably been over 100. I would have been over 100, but sort of kind of sad I had to go back to Kennedy, right? But that's why journalism is about, covering those stories and those kind of things. Oh, we lost Dan.
Yeah, we lost Dan. Hopefully Dan will come back and everything. Because I did have another question for him based on where we are with newspapers, whether they've still got a life. Because I know some people think that they don't have a life and everything, and they are a thing of the past. So maybe y'all can answer that, and maybe Dan will come back. But Jacoby, any thoughts? Because I know some people are of the opinion that journalism is gone and that the newspapers are on their way out, much the way you were talking last night about late night television being on its way out, Rick, and everything. But what is y'all's take on journalism as to whether we will continue to have that print paper or that glossy paper?
Well, a lot of the advertising money has gone away. So you look at magazines. Vogue, it used to have a famous September issue that was 1,000 pages thick. It was yay thick, and now even that famous issue of Vogue is probably a third the size it used to be, where advertisers are not willing to spend money on media that doesn't seem to return on the advertising dollar, though that also applies to social media, Twitter and stuff, because there's no decent metric for your returns on social media. The numbers there are often garbage.
Hey, Dan, really quickly, one of the questions I was asking everybody was, does newspapers have a future? Because, you've always got people that are putting out that demise that newspapers are going to be gone, that we won't have newspapers in the year 2090 or something like that. But you are a journalist, as am I. But what is your thoughts? Is newspapers going to be like of the dinosaur age at some point or another?
The methods of producing newspapers have changed, went through technological change. They got away from the linotypes, hot types, into cold type, and different ways of production. But the work that journalists didn't change that much. The methods of developing sources, of creating abilities to respond to news in those situations, I think were underpinned by newspapers. Newspapers were the leader in that. But with the internet, the change in the business model, the loss of classified ads, which was such an important part of the metric in developing revenue to sustain local journalism, has been lost to these changes. We need to find a way to bring back print media, not necessarily on newsprint thrown on your driveway by newsboys, although I did that before I was a journalist. That may never come back and probably won't come back. But those institutions, the newspapers themselves, the organization of newsrooms, the development of journalists for good, responsible reporting needs to somehow be revived. Whatever the method or technologies are that deliver those abilities to write, to create vigorous journalism, we need to find a way to bring that back. Is it nonprofit organizations? Is it supported by foundations? Is it supported in other ways? This is something I think that needs to be thoroughly explored, and we need to find a way to create an alternative to what we have today, which is more commentary than reporting, or reporting that is colored by commentary throughout, or not produced in a good, accurate, responsible way. We need changes.
In the course of a normal day, what news sources do you go to? Just to
I look at MSNBC. I look at Fox News. I look at CNN. I look at my local newspaper when I can access it online. I look at the weekly newspaper in Cannon Beach, Oregon. It's not so much that I'm a news junkie, but I really like to know what's going on around me, and I like to know what the reporting is that's being done, because I'm a lifelong journalist. I admire good reporting. I love great writing. I see long form journalism in magazines on a national scale that I support, and or to listen if we're doing audio on things that are being reported vigorously by journalists.
And then you've almost broken there.
At every day, I continue to try to find ways to discover what's being reported. I can't really compare it to my own reporting because I'm not out there covering those stories locally that I'm seeing other journalists cover. But that's my approach these days.
Dan, just really quickly along those same lines, because even coming back to Steve's question earlier and everything, what is your take on the reporting of the international scene? Because I know we got a lot of international conflicts, and Sasha's here, and we've got things going on in Israel, we've got things going on in Ukraine and Russia, we've got things going on in Somalia and a number of other places. But I just wanted your take on the international reporting, maybe compared to the days of the old and even compared to what you see now.
Well, one of the reporters I like on television that's out there is Richard Engel. And one of the things I like about him is he's on the scene. He's right there where things are happening. There's so many courageous journalists covering such difficult situations, like in Gaza, like elsewhere in the world, in Ukraine. The tremendous courage that's required to be out there, and the physical stress of being in a dangerous, difficult situation. I think there is some good international reporting that's being done by television. I don't see as much in the print media, because the print media is not funding the kinds of bureaus internationally. They're not staffing them as well. They're still the New York Times, the Washington Post. Others are doing that, but you're not seeing the Louisville Courier Journal sending a journalist to Gaza. I'm guessing that. I don't know that for a fact, but the that kind of network of journalists, as with the rest of it, deteriorated. So we don't get as much in-depth reporting as we did. We get the events, we get the top of the news, we get the leads and the first three paragraphs of stories like we used to do in the days of vigorous newspaper work. But I do think there's some good reporting going on, at least in the major points. What we don't hear is far down the line, the more in-depth reporting, the reporting on other situations in foreign countries, so that we don't get all of the news that we probably could use. We get just the top line.
You know, I'm a Democrat, but do you believe? And I'm more bipartisan because I'm at the city level, looking to run for county or congressional seat in a few years. But one question I have is, do you believe that the media has been playing too much of a role in predicting the results of elections, which, quite frankly, when things are thrown out there about polling and that Vice President Harris is leading in all the swing states, doesn't it create a false sense of security, like what happened with Hillary Clinton, where we don't really know how accurate these polls are? How responsible is the media for saying things like that? And then all of a sudden, let's say Trump wins again, that people go, wait a minute, I thought, right now, if you listen to the media, even though I'm a Democrat, it sounds like Vice President Harris has won. And I've been going to cocktail parties and Democratic parties, and people are already asking for jobs in the administration. And we're only 100 days away from the election, and she hasn't won the election.
No.
So what do you say to that?
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion out there as to what is accurate. We know we're in a troubled time as far as misinformation and disinformation. I don't think the polls have ever really contributed to helping us understand what's really going on. And I think you're right. There's a false sense of security for those that feel that they are able to predict what's coming. I've always been concerned about coverage of national political events when they're reporting on the results of elections on the East Coast before people have even been in the voting booth on the West Coast. That was a time when concerns were expressed about how does that influence people as to whether or not to go to the polls. Maybe it's too late on the West Coast for you to have an impact because things are already decided. When national news outlets declare a winner here or there based on early results at a limited number of polls, I think it can change the way people react and what they do when they go to the polls in their own and local communities. So I think that's something that doesn't contribute much to helping us understand what's going on in our political environment. These polls in general, I think, are so misleading. They are so often wrong. We don't know what questions are asked. We only know the results or what's reported as results of the polls. So it's not reliable. And I think as I look at the national political scene right now and what we're coming to, I think we are suffering from misinformation that may be not intentional, but just not helpful.
Hey, Sasha, any questions really quickly and everything? We've been having this long conversation with this gentleman who's got journalism fame and everything, but a good one. If you have any thoughts, and maybe you tell we've got one as well as we wind down.
Okay, very quick question. You mentioned that you value the reporting from the hot points like Ukraine or Gaza, Israel, when the correspondents are there on the ground. Now, my objection to it is that if you are on the ground, you are, for example, in case of Ukraine, Russia, you are on Ukrainian ground, or you are on the Russian ground, and depends where you are will heavily influence your reporting, and that it cannot be objective. On the other hand, there is no such thing, in my opinion, as objective reporting on the war, which is ongoing, and the situation is changing almost not even daily, by the hours, and so on. And some question which relates to that is how you report on Israeli-Gaza conflict when obviously you cannot be on the Gaza side, period. It's simply impossible. And if you're on Israeli side, you are most likely will view it from the point of Israel, although it's not as obvious as in the case of Russia-Ukrainian war. You can be on Israeli side and still report not objectively, but close to it. That's what I mean.
Well, I think you raise an important point. Objective reporting is an ideal that's never really been dependable. I think fairness and accuracy are the standards by which we should evaluate reporting. Objectivity requires you to divorce yourself so much from what's going on that you may not be able to adequately develop the information that needs to be reported. I can't be totally objective on everything because of my cultural background, because of my own perspective on the world, the way I grew up, the experiences I had, far different from those in other countries who have been involved in a different environment. So objectivity might be an ideal, but it's not a functional opportunity really for us. But I do think with fair, accurate reporting, with the contributions of reporters in the field, whether they're on the Russian side of the border or the Ukrainian side of the border, they are contributing information to what's going on that we need. Not all reporting is accurate. Not all of it is uncolored by personal perspectives. In fact, most of it is colored in some ways by personal perspective.
Well, there is one more important point. You see, if you are on the line, for example, right now in the Kursk region of Russia, when the Ukrainians are attacking, and if you're on the ground, and you're reporting how brave Ukrainian soldiers are and how they conducted this operation in complete secrecy. And nobody knew about that. And Biden denied that he knew anything about it. He was just informed, and then he was consulted once every 4 or 5 hours and so on. But again, when you are looking at the bigger picture, it all falls apart. All this story falls completely apart. There are now information that 2 weeks prior to the Ukrainian invasion in Russian territory, there were changes in U.S. apparatus who is in charge. And it was Phil Gordon now came and lied, and he was conducting, because he was not part of any secret agreements reached between U.S. government in 2021, when U.S. officials traveled to Moscow, and they were discussing possible war, and they discussed that Ukrainian army will never enter the Russian territory, and under assumption of that is a deal, that's how the war was run for 2.5 years. And all of a sudden, when Phil Gordon came in charge of that, he was not part of the secret negotiations. He didn't care about that. And he discussed with the close advisor to Zelensky, Mr. Yermak. He had several telephone conversations with Phil Gordon, and they've discussed and agreed on the separation. And this is complete nonsense. What even very respectable journalists are talking about this war and secrecy and everything else, when there is no such thing. How could you imagine that Ukrainians could have such an action without not only consulting US, but even getting validation for this action? So how you do report, how you can keep the truth, how you can be, whether you're on the ground or above the ground or nowhere in the ground, how you can truthfully report about all this.
But we're going to have to answer that on the next show because we're running out of time. We want to thank Dan Smuzziter, who's
and let Dan say how he can get in touch with how they can get a copy of the book really quick.
Right. Yeah, and we'll probably put it on the
through
Pod TV.
Amazon.com, through the publisher Trine Day, which is here in Oregon, Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Those places are carrying it online.
Okay, and
Thank
Mark,
you,
let's get it on the Pod TV bookstore too.
We'll do that.
Tomorrow morning, we'll be talking about Joe Biden's last speech to the American people, which will be this evening at about 9 evening. President Biden will be addressing the convention of the nation as he says goodbye and pass the torch on to the forebear of the Democratic Party, who is only a few days away from formally being the nominee of the Democratic Party for the office of President of the United States. Dan, thank you for being with us. Look forward to reaching out. I'll get your information from Mark so we can connect.
All right, we'll see you next.
Thank
tomorrow.
you. It was
Bye-bye.
my pleasure.